Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Women in Diplomacy, organized by the Consulate General of Switzerland in Vancouver. My name is Andreas Rufer. I'm the Consul General of Switzerland here in Vancouver on British Columbia's West Coast. The webinar in this third is the third one in a series of gender equality that we have organized so far. In 2019, we started the program talking about women in science, followed by women in business last year. This year, Switzerland marks the 50th anniversary of the implementation of women's right to vote on federal matters and to elect representatives and being elected into the Swiss Parliament. Therefore, we take this opportunity to speak today about how women are represented and have a say in government and diplomacy. I would like to thank our keynote speaker, Swiss Ambassador to Canada, Salome Meyer, my colleagues from the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, Consul General Henk Snoeken and Consul General Nicole Davison, as well as Lara Campbell, Professor of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University, for accepting our invitation to be on the panel and to share their insights on this topic. With no further ado, I am passing the word to Nina Bader. Nina is the Science and Technology Officer in my team. She has initiated the series on gender questions and will moderate this event. Thank you, Nina, and thank you all for participating. I look forward to the discussion on such an important topic as gender equality. Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Consul General, and also a warm welcome from my side. My name is Nina Bader, and I'm very happy to welcome you today for our panel discussion on women in diplomacy. As Andrea already mentioned, this is our third Women in event, and I couldn't be happier that we chose the topic of women in diplomacy. And first, some technical information. Please keep your microphone muted during the event. You can ask questions in our chat function, and we will dedicate about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the panel discussion to your questions. Also, please be aware that this session is recorded and we will upload it on our YouTube channel. And now, before we start this discussion, we would like to make a little survey with 2 short questions. We would be curious to know from where you're joining us and how you learned about our event. So the poll should pop up now, and I would like to ask you to fill out those 2 questions. I see we have many people joining from British Columbia, from Eastern Canada, some from the United States and Europe. That's fantastic. It's a global event now, officially. Okay, I think we have most answers ready. Thank you very much. I can share the result if curious to see. And British Columbia, and then hear from where you heard about our event. Great, thank you very much for participating in this poll. Now I would like to introduce you to our speakers for today's event. Our keynote speech will be held by the Ambassador of Switzerland in Canada, Salome Meyer. She took up her position in Canada in February 2019. Prior to this, she was the diplomatic advisor to the Swiss president in Bern. And during that time, she also served as the president of the Swiss Association of Career Diplomats. Further assignments brought her to China, the UK, and South Korea. Our first panelist today is Nicole Davison. She took up her position as British Consul General in Vancouver in July 2016 and is the British government's representative in BC, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. Nicole joined the Foreign Commonwealth Office in 1988 and has served in South Africa, Bangladesh, Ukraine, China, and Croatia. Our second panelist, Henk Snoeken, is the Consul General of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Vancouver. We're very happy to welcome a male panelist on this panel, as we believe it's important to have female and male policymakers at the table when we talk about equality. So Henk has held various positions in the Dutch ministry, including Deputy Director of National Spatial Planning and Deputy Director for International Relations at the Ministry of Infrastructure and the Environment. As the Consul General in Vancouver, he focuses his economic work on agri-tech, water, ports and climate, and clean tech. And our third speaker today is Lara Campbell. She's Professor of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. She is specialized in 20th century North American gender and women's history, the history of social activism, feminist movements and theories, and gender and the welfare state. Just last year, she became Associate Dean, undergraduate programs, teaching and learning, and student experience. Her most current book is the one on the history of women and political citizenship and is entitled The Great Revolutionary Wave, Women and the Vote in BC. So that's a great lecture for our events today. Now I would like to pass on the word to our keynote speaker, Ambassador Salome Meyer.
Thank you, Anina. Thank you, Andreas, for organizing this fascinating event. I'm greatly looking forward to the discussion later on. And it's of course a great pleasure to me to participate in an event on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of women's rights to vote in Switzerland. Now, one question that I often get is why did it take so long? Why was the women's suffrage only introduced in 1971? And there are various reasons for that, but maybe one of the more important ones is the Swiss-style democratic system, because in our system of direct democracy in Switzerland, it is not government, it's not parliament, but rather the electorate who has the final say on issues. So we have a lot of referenda. And in the case of women's suffrage, this electorate was exclusively male. So the vote 50 years ago was actually the second attempt to introduce women's suffrage in Switzerland by ways of a referendum. A previous one was held in 1959, and that one was unsuccessful. And the arguments against women's suffrage at the time included the notion that politics would be too dirty for women, children would become depraved, bedraggled if women started to engage in political decision-making. And then finally, and this is not, I don't invent that, that was one of the slogans, who would cook for the men if women were out in town voting? And so it took another 12 years. It took also a more assertive movement of feminist pioneers, better organized activism. It took a younger generation that came of age in the 60s with all the cultural, political change that became broad. And it also took a demographic trend reinforcing, let's say, the more overall liberal urban centers before a second referendum on women's suffrage was finally successful in 1971. Now, one other important factor I'd like to mention is that in 1971, the Swiss government was clearly more proactively promoting women's suffrage. And the government did so because times have changed, but also because they wanted to join the European Convention on Human Rights at the time. And initially the plan was to actually opt out of the convention's clause concerning women's political rights. But this caused a significant backlash domestically and a considerable sort of amount of criticism internationally. So instead of opting out, the government finally decided to promote those rights domestically. And I find it personally quite interesting that apart from the complex domestic dynamics, an important element was international relations. It was the diplomatic multilateral engagement that helped bring home this vote on women's suffrage in 71. And that's the segue basically to the main topic of today's event, women in diplomacy. Now, the idea of women in diplomacy in Switzerland didn't actually start with the voting rights for women, and it didn't even start in Switzerland. It started in another place, half a world away, and I'm happy to see there are some participants from the US because it started in Washington, DC. On the 15th of April, 1953, the New York Times carried an article entitled, "A Woman Slated as Envoy to Bern, It's a Slap at Anti-Feminist Swiss." The American ambassador in question was Frances E. Willis, who happened to be also the first career diplomat, the first US career diplomat. And her appointment was the first of a female ambassador to Switzerland and to Europe overall. And of course, that made headlines. One Swiss magazine noted with a certain undertone of relief that, quote, "Miss Willis seems to be modest and discreet, even though she has studied and obtained a PhD." And the Swiss government was a little bit taken aback too. One of the ministers wondered if this appointment of a female ambassador means that the US considers Switzerland to be negligible. And finally, the Swiss Foreign Ministry also struggled with Ambassador Willis' impending arrival. The head of protocol was desperately trying to find out how to address a female ambassador, because as he pointed out in a memo, the term Madam Ambassador was, of course, already reserved for the wives of male ambassadors. So Ambassador Willis arrived, and lo and behold, she did a great job. And interestingly, her arrival coincided with a notable development within the Swiss Foreign Ministry itself, and that was a review of the recruitment process for diplomats. In 1956, the Swiss ministry introduced a new competitive entry exam for prospective career diplomats. And this exam was open to both men and for the first time also to women. So the women could become diplomats, but they couldn't vote at the time. However, there was a caveat. Yes, women could become diplomats, but they had to be and they had to remain unmarried, because it was assumed that for a married woman, the conflict of interest between the nation's and the husband's interest would just be potentially too big. And this unmarried rule for women diplomats actually was in place until 1980. So by the time I entered the Swiss diplomatic service, all these institutional barriers had been abolished. Yet women remained to be clearly underrepresented all the way from recruitment to the top level of the diplomatic service. And it took the first and so far only female foreign minister to take active measures towards gender parity, and she did so in 2006 by basically introducing quota for recruitment. And that was heavily criticized from within the ministry, from within the diplomatic corps as well, both women and men, as well as the wider public. And maybe we'll have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the merits of quotas in our discussion later. But in my opinion, what this step certainly did was to create a conversation, to raise awareness, and it ultimately led to a policy to promote gender equality within the ministry. So if we fast forward to today, the Swiss Foreign Ministry has reached gender parity at the entry level and near gender parity at mid-level management. However, only 20% of heads of mission in the Swiss diplomatic networks are women. And again, here I'm interested to hear from the other panelists how the situation is in their ministry, where they see the reasons for this continued disproportional representation. But to conclude my remarks, I am optimistic because the conversation on gender equality, I have noticed, has evolved. Equality is increasingly merging with the notion of diversity, and that's something that is quite established, I feel, in North America, but maybe less so in continental Europe. Gender equality in my ministry, in the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has moved from an issue perceived as a challenge for HR departments to one that's perceived as actually an opportunity to increase the footprint of our foreign policy interests. And that makes sense because, after all, diplomacy is about networks, and the more diverse your diplomatic corps, the better placed you are to create and to valorize, to use these networks. And so in that sense, I believe that foreign ministries not just have a vested interest in promoting gender equality and diversity overall, they're actually also well placed to make it a reality. So with that, I will conclude my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this interesting overview of the women's suffrage movement in Switzerland, and also how the representation of women in our ministry developed over time. In our panel discussion, we will now build on this and first talk about the history of women's suffrage in the countries represented, because the history of women in diplomacy and in public offices is closely intertwined with the women's suffrage movement. In the second part of the discussion, we will focus more on the measures to ensure equal representation in the foreign ministry and future challenges. So let's dive into the discussion. Nicole, I would like to start with you first. So the demand for women's suffrage was made very early in the UK, as early as of the beginning of the 19th century. Can you give us a brief overview of the women's suffrage movement in the UK and explain why it took until 1928 before women were allowed to vote?
Yeah, absolutely, happy to. And first of all, thank you so much for having me as part of this panel. It's a fascinating and incredibly important subject, so I'm delighted to be here. I mean, as you say, Nina, the demands for women's suffrage actually started incredibly early in in England and the United Kingdom. So as early as 1832, when we brought in the Great Reform Act, which actually opened up the possibility to vote to men who were landowners and sort of brought in greater suffrage for male voters. And at that time, there was a certain class of women who felt that they should also have a say in politics. And so the demand for the ability to vote started actually very, very early. But it didn't really get very far because these were very peaceful protests. And whilst peaceful protest is always, a good way to go, in this particular instance, it didn't really have any effect until the women's suffrage movement started gaining a more extreme side to it. So that takes us to the early 1900s, when it became quite a militant organization, in the sense that women's suffrage fighters thought that they really had to up the steps to actually gain some attention and gain some movement. So that's when we started seeing things like hunger strikes happening, women chaining themselves to the railings of the House of Commons, taking sort of quite extreme action. One of the most famous cases is the suffragette Emily Davison. No relative of mine that I know of, but she threw herself under the King's horses in 1913 and died as a result. And these types of instances really started to sort of raise the ante on the conversation. But it really wasn't until the First World War that the women's movement really gained in traction, and that's because we saw women moving more into male jobs as men were away fighting, etc. So that's what kind of really turned the situation around, when this sort of notion that women could actually step into certain roles that had previously been filled by men. So therefore, why couldn't they also step into votes? I think one thing that's quite important to point out, and that's perhaps not commonly known, is that actually, come to 1918, in the UK, it was actually only 58% of men who could vote as well. A lot of men were disenfranchised. So you had to be a landowner, you had to be able to, or if you weren't a landowner, you had to be able to afford rent of over £10 a year to be able to vote. And that actually only translated into 58% of men being able to vote as well. And then fast forward to the end of the war, there was also a stipulation that men had to have been resident in England or the United Kingdom for a year before being able to vote. And of course, that took away a lot of the soldiers who'd been away fighting in Europe, etc. So this whole women's movement was then kind of wrapped up in this wider male suffrage debate as well. So that's why come 1918, there was a greater enfranchisement, and women over 30 who owned property were then allowed to vote. But as you can imagine, that was then a minimum of women. But that then finally led to 1928 and equal franchise for women over 21. And the age of voting was lowered to 18 in 1970. But it was a process really of kind of increased militancy, First World War, increased male suffrage, small steps for women's suffrage leading to wider enfranchisement. So that's kind of a potted history of the UK.
Thank you so much. And I think we'll come back to the approach that UK suffragists chose when we talk about BC. We get back to that again. And Henk, could you give us a brief overview of the women's suffrage movement in the Netherlands? I think you need to unmute yourself. Still? It didn't work yet, I think. Not yet. You're still on mute. Okay. Well, then let's go to you, Lara, and let's talk about BC, or first about Canada, and then a bit about the particularities that BC had actually when it comes to the women's suffrage movement.
Sure. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay. I apologize for the headset. I'm up at my office at SFU and all the students are back, so it can get a little noisy in the hallway. But thank you very much for inviting me. This is really a real honor for me to be here and have a chance to talk about my work on the suffrage movement in Canada. So just a very quick historical overview. I really first began this project when Veronica Strong-Bogue, who's a leading women's historian in Canada, she had this vision for rethinking the suffrage movement in Canada from a regional perspective. A lot of ink had been spilt on the suffrage movement in Canada as women's history developed as a field. So in the 1970s, 80s, even into the 1990s. But Nikki really had this idea that maybe bringing a regional perspective would be a good idea. And I think it does make a lot of sense. Hopefully you were all watching the election last night, and so you got a good sense of why region matters in Canadian history. It particularly matters when you're talking about voting rights, because the right to vote really differed by province. It could even differ by municipality. So the desire to win the franchise really takes place in Canada at the local level, the provincial level, and the federal level. And sometimes those campaigns connected, and sometimes they did not connect. So quite often when I give a talk, people say, well, when did women get the right to vote in Canada? And when did women get the right to vote in BC? And it's a question I can't really answer very well, because the right to vote depended on your age, your occupation, your gender, your race, national origin, and your property status, similar in many ways to what's happening in Great Britain. So I started to think of voting and the suffrage movement, or voting rights, as a kind of spider web of restrictions and rights that are really all entangled quite closely together, that are quite hard to separate. So a very brief overview would be that the suffrage movement in Canada really begins around the 1870s and 1880s within the context of the burgeoning women's movement. Although I want to note here that African Canadian women in what is now Ontario, who were also slavery abolitionists, they were demanding the right to vote for women as early as the 1850s and the 1860s in Canada. So it really depends on what area you're looking at and what time period. Non-Indigenous and non-Asian women in most provinces across the country won municipal voting rights by property. You had to own a certain amount of property in the 1880s, school board voting rights in the 1890s, and provincial voting rights between 1916, Manitoba is the first, Quebec is the last in 1940. And those same sets of women win the federal franchise in 1918. And a quick note here in British Columbia, and this is really interesting to hear about Switzerland and the idea of a referendum. British Columbia was the only province in Canada that put women's voting rights to a referendum, and that was in 1916, and they won the referendum. Actually, the majority of men voted to give women voting rights. Suffragists were really angry because, of course, only men could vote. They thought this was deeply undemocratic and unfair. And I will note that they almost won voting rights in the legislature in 1898. So they had won over through persuasion a number of male politicians. They held a vote called the motion, and unfortunately, one of the MLAs put his hand up at the wrong time, and he voted no when he meant to vote yes, but they wouldn't let him take it back. And so had his vote been counted correctly, women would have won the right to vote in British Columbia in 1898. So there were some moments of heartbreak in this long movement for women's voting rights. But we'll come back to this at the end, but it is important to remember that in British Columbia, actually BC had some of the longest lasting racial restrictions on provincial voting. Between 1947 and 1949 is when you see those racial restrictions be taken away after a human rights campaign after the end of World War II. I guess the last thing I'd say in terms of what makes BC unique, in some ways very similar to the kind of women's movements that are happening all around the world, women arguing on the basis of the fact that they're mothers and mothers have a right to say in the policies that affect their children. But I will say that historians have often been quite convinced that women were very polite in Canada and very conservative. And certainly what I found is women were very loud and very publicly vocal about their right to vote. They never hesitated to stand up, sometimes on soapboxes in public, and to take on anti-suffrage men and anti-suffrage arguments. And probably the last thing that I would say makes BC really unique is that it had the only working class women's suffrage movement in all of Canada. And that was actually located in Vancouver. And it was created by a very active suffragist labor organizer who immigrated from England, from London. She was a skilled tailor and a labor organizer. And under her work, Vancouver had an incredibly thriving working class suffrage movement scene that made it really distinct from other places in Canada. So I'll just leave it there, but I'm also happy to answer questions later.
Okay, thank you so much, Lara. I will come back to you. I will give them the microphone now to Henk, and then I will come back to the Canada-Europe comparison. But Henk, the floor is yours. Can you tell us about the...
Nina, I hope I can take the microphone now and that you hear me. I'm so sorry.
Yes.
This is this is the Zoom time where men who think that they can work with techniques don't succeed in working with it. A little bit about the suffrage movement in the Netherlands. I think the history is quite in line with what Nicole told about how it was going at the United Kingdom. In about, I think, the 1870s in the Netherlands, a large discussion about women's suffrage started. Let's say obtaining the women's voting rights went a little bit hand in hand with a wish to get also admission to higher education for women. Those two things were intertwined for a long time. The right to be admitted to universities and so on went a bit faster. The first lady who went to a Dutch university started in 1878 her studies in the Netherlands, famous name Aletta Jacobs, and in 2 years, so she was a very good. She got her degree, but it took until 1919 that women's rights were given to Dutch citizens. One thing I wanted to bring also on the table is that with having the voting right, of course, not all the rights for women were also equal. I talked to my mother a few days ago and asked her, how was it for you when you started working? And she told me, and I felt a little bit ashamed and also a bit surprised, that when I was born in 1964, she had to stop her work. She was working in the tax service of the Dutch government, and it was not seen as a good sign that the mother of a young son would work in those times. So there was still a lot to be done. 1964, of course, at the time of the second feminist movement, which led to much more rights in the field of self-determination, I think, sexual freedom, and of course also economic independence. Well, we were quite early in the field of voting rights, but there was still a lot to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you so much, Henk. And now I would like to make the connection between Europe and Canada. Back to you, Lara.
Sure.
So let's talk a bit about the connection between BC and UK or Europe. How did the sometimes militant movement in the UK and the rest of Europe influence BC? And is there a connection between the two?
There is absolutely a connection, and it was surprising to me, because the story that historians have told is that the movement in Canada was very polite, very conservative. They weren't much interested in the kind of militancy that Nicole was talking about with the Women's Social and Political Union, the arson, the targeted property damage. But actually, BC women had quite close ties to British suffragettes like Emmeline Pankhurst and the Pethick Lawrences and Barbara Wiley and others, mainly because there were high rates of British immigration to British Columbia in particular. It was quite a high rate of immigration, and many of those women had been aware of these debates around militancy and had been active in various suffrage organizations in the UK. So what we know is that BC women did not engage in that kind of direct action, but they talked a lot about it and they publicly debated it. They really admired women like Emily Davison, for example. They saw women who sacrificed their bodies, in some cases their lives, as martyrs to a greater good, heroines who were willing to sacrifice their bodies for a greater cause. BC suffrage leagues deliberately chose the colors of the Women's Social and Political Union. So purple, white, and green were the colors that you see in the UK out of the militant suffragettes, and BC women deliberately chose those colors. I think to send a message to politicians. So one thing they would like to do is meet with the Premier to put forward a suffrage petition, and they would tie it in a purple, white, and green ribbon and present it. And they would use this really sophisticated rhetoric. So sometimes they would say, we haven't needed militancy yet, but here's this petition that we're signing in this color scheme that has something to do with militancy, and don't put it past us to go the same route that some of those British women are going. So they would sort of use that to try and push politicians to say, if even British women can behave in this way, look out, it might come to Canada. And they even started in Victoria, they started an affiliated chapter of the Women's Social and Political Union. It didn't last very long, but I think that scared a few local politicians as well. And they also loved to invite, before the war, there was a flow of British suffragettes. So the Emmeline Pankhurst came to British Columbia, the Pethick Lawrences came, they stayed for a year because they had relatives in Victoria. Barbara Wiley, a radical activist, her brother lived in Saskatchewan. So they had these kind of familial connections and really enjoyed having lots of debates, bringing out crowds of people. And when you read about it, a lot of booing and hissing and clapping and cheering all at the same time. So definitely a strong connection to the UK.
Okay, thank you so much. And then another component I would like to talk about, and we've seen it now with all the three of you, that the suffrage movement was a movement for men, for women, for different people, because not everybody had the right to vote. And one particularity in BC was that it was very strong, based on strong assumption of race and racial hierarchy. And can you tell us a bit more about that? I know you touched it a bit, but just could you talk a bit more about that, Lara?
Yeah, in British Columbia, there was a very strong anti-Asian sentiment that I'm sure people are aware of that history. Certainly the labor movement, the suffrage movement, all opposed Asian immigration to British Columbia and actively campaigned to restrict further Asian immigration. So many suffragists were involved in, for example, trying to restrict the lobbying efforts of South Asian men. So male laborers who very much wanted to bring their wives and families to Canada. So really this right to vote is kind of bound up with this idea of BC ideally being a white, British-based, respectable province. So there's that component. There is also the fact that there was a fair bit of European xenophobia as well in British Columbia, particularly towards Eastern and Southern European immigrants. So BC had lower rates of migration from those areas, but there was some, particularly in the interior. And many BC women really resented the fact that in British Columbia, you could, after a 6-month period of residency, European immigrant men could vote. They didn't see them as respectable. They didn't necessarily speak English. Often they were Catholic, and BC was a highly Protestant province. And so their language around voting rights was very much that respectable, literate, educated women should vote. Why are we allowing European immigrant men to vote? So it's really not until the 1940s. It's with, after the end of World War II, the development of human rights campaigns in British Columbia in particular, where we start to see a push towards allowing Indigenous men and women to vote, and Japanese, Chinese, and South Asian men and women to vote as well. But the last restriction is in place until 1949.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Lara, for those insights. I share you have, before we move to the second part of this discussion, I'd like to show a few pictures that you brought from BC. If you can see my screen now with a few pictures that Lara brought.
I just wanted you to see that's a little referendum handbill, you know, because the suffragists got out to campaign. This image on the top is the only, there aren't very many photographs, sadly, in British Columbia. This is the only image that exists in British Columbia of a suffrage parade. It's a parade that they put a float in, and you can see them leading the way on their horses. And the float on the back is a representative from every country in the world where women had the right to vote, all dressed in white with laurel crowns on their heads. So, and that woman on the left, Mary Ellen Smith, is the first woman elected to the Legislative Assembly in 1918, and the first female cabinet minister in the British Empire.
Perfect. I think that's a perfect transition from the historical overview to the representation of women in diplomacy or in politics. Let me stop sharing my screen. So, yes, so let's come to the second part of our discussion. Here I would like to start with you, Henk. There have been several feminist movements, as you mentioned, many laws that have been passed over the last decades. But what measures has the Dutch government taken over the years to ensure equal representation in the foreign ministry? And if you could provide some numbers, that would be great, like first female ambassador that was appointed and how many ambassadors you have today.
So Nina, please, I sent you a picture of how our diplomatic corps was about 30 years ago. I think it was beginning of the 90s, and perhaps you could show that to us. It gives a little bit of an image how.
Sorry, I have to, yes, I have the picture here. 1 second. Here we go.
So this is about, I think, 35 years ago, beginning of the 90s. This is our diplomatic corps. If you look very well, then you see somewhere a lady sitting there. There's one lady in the room. This was the yearly ambassadors conference where all the ambassadors are asked to go back to the Netherlands to have their discussions about the situation of the world and what we should do as diplomats about it. Nearly at completely the right side, above the gentleman with the light suit, there you see a lady sitting. And I don't think she was ambassador, but she was Consul General or something alike. What you could say is this is too old, too white, and too undiverse. And perhaps now you can go to the second picture, Nina, which is the situation of 2 years ago. This is the diplomatic corps of the Netherlands 2 years ago. In the middle, the two ladies in shining red, the one at the left side with the reddish hair is our Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the lady in the right blouson is Minister Kaag, our Minister of Foreign Affairs up till 2 days ago. She's just stepped back from her function. Well, what you see is there's more color, not only in the picture itself, but there's more female ambassadors, as you see. I've been counting how it looked like from the 185 people that were in this conference. About 53 were female, 43 ambassadors, 4 consul generals, 3 special representatives, and 3 special envoys. So the situation has become better. Is this a result of policy measures? Now you can take the picture back. You can leave the picture, Nina. Is this a result of very targeted policy or laws being on the table? I don't think that was the case. We have, I think, since the 80s, 90s, a diversity politics, which is a kind of policy that we do for all the ministries and all the governments in the Netherlands, but a specific gender policy, we also combined with targets in numbers, has never been very popular in the Netherlands. And has also not been implemented in the policy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Nevertheless, a lot has changed in the last years, as you have seen. The focus in our policy in, let's say, the last 10 years, I think, has been more on diversity in a broad sense. So also people from different LGBTI backgrounds, having them represented in the staff of the ministry. People from with different nationality, ethnic backgrounds, having them in the staff of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it was always a part of the general policy of the civil service in the Netherlands. But based on this policy, you still see that the image is a little bit the same, although it is better. It is too old, too white, and too male, still at this moment. When you look at it from a different side and approach it perhaps a little bit more positive, when you would look at the age of the people on the photo we just saw, is that the majority of ambassadors under 55 is female. So there's a kind of hope that the image will change very dramatically in due course. So it's going in the right direction. Are there no measures at all? Of course there are. Some of the cabinets in the last years have been working hard on getting more female ambassadors at the right levels. I think in the last 10 years, a diversity of ministers has worked on that. Do we have exact numbers? No, but I think there has been a lot of training instruments implemented in the organization. So it's more a kind of an HRM policy. For example, at the moment, all the senior staff members in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are obliged to follow a course, a training in unconscious bias. So what happens with you when you are in a situation where you are selecting people for a new job? Where does your unconscious bias direct you in a certain direction? That's not helpful to get a good representation of the whole population staff. Second kind of policy, instrument we are using very much is policy to work much on the mobility of younger women entering the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a bit with the idea, when you're in, we're going to follow you and give you all the opportunities to come at the right level, and also at the senior staff levels, where it's perhaps a little bit more difficult to go to. As I said before, more in a general diversity perspective, but I think with quite some results, and hopeful for the future with so many young women in senior positions.
Thank you very much, Henk, for the critical but also very optimistic outlook. Thank you so much. And now I would like to give the word to Nicole. Same questions. What are the measurements that the British government has taken over the past couple of years? And if you could give us some numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I would say is that the situation has changed quite significantly over the course of a generation. So similarly to the Swiss Foreign Ministry, female diplomats had to resign once they got married until 1973. So you could be a diplomat, but you couldn't be married. And so if you did marry, as I say, it resulted in resignation. So I think what that meant for people coming in sort of within the next 15 to 20 years, was that there were no senior female role models, or at least none that had managed to combine family and marriage and a career. So the result of that was, I think, a bit of a gap in terms of women's advancement. And so what the Foreign Office did over the years was really work hard at things like mentoring programs for female diplomats, and then particularly as female diplomats were rising up through the ranks, then they would kind of be mentoring the new generation that were coming in. Where we are now is that it's not a target, it's not a quota, it's more of a target, but we aim to have about 15% of our senior leadership as female representation. I don't think we're quite there yet. We probably need to work a little bit harder on that, but at the last count, about 60 of our ambassadors were female. But what is a really good story for us is that most of us, or a lot of our senior posts, are held by female diplomats. So the UK, as you know, is a member of the G7. So aside from the UK, Japan is the only country where we do not have a female ambassador. So Canada, Germany, France, the US, all have female ambassadors at the moment. And until recently here in Canada, for example, we had all heads of our post here in Canada were female as well. But my new colleague in Calgary is male, so we can no longer boast about that. But I think it's really sort of taken quite a long while to sort of evolve into a situation where we have, I think, the ability to have a career, take time out to have children, come back to that career, be able to pick up where you left off, not be disadvantaged by the time taken out. The other thing that we do is we have a very active women's network in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So certain directorates, when they're recruiting for positions, if they feel that they haven't got enough female interest in certain positions, they will then work with the women's network to hold information sessions and education sessions about why certain postings are attractive to female diplomats. But I think one area where that's particularly relevant is around perhaps postings in Africa, postings in the Middle East, where you traditionally might feel a little bit disadvantaged if you are a female diplomat, which actually raises a whole other question about the representation of the UK abroad and wanting to represent the UK in its entirety. So therefore sending female diplomats to places where actually gender equity isn't so established is actually, it's a good thing to do, but it's challenging for the people taking up the post. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the other thing that we need to look at more and more is around the question of intersectionality. So gender is obviously one area that we look at, but then there's the overlap with LGBTQ, racial diversity as well, and that intersectionality issues is increasingly important to us. But I was actually really struck that in terms of numbers, we really, I think, very closely reflect where the Swiss Foreign Ministry is at the moment. We have pretty much gender parity in the lower grades, almost gender parity in the mid grades, but need to work a little bit harder on our senior level representation.
Very interesting. Thank you, Nicole, for sharing. And I think it's some notes are quite optimistic, but I think we can all agree that there is still some work to do. So we're a bit behind time, but I think it would be nice to talk shortly about future challenges. Henk and Nicole, I think, Nicole, you already talked a bit about it, if you want to add anything to that, but I think you mentioned about the whole diversity question, then the regions you were talking about, mentorship, role model. Is there anything else you would like to add to future challenges?
No, I think that pretty much summed it up. I mean, I think for me, the future challenge is how we can kind of get equity of opportunity as well as equity of gender. And by that, I mean opening up postings across the board for anybody who wants to take up a posting in a certain place, and that they shouldn't be precluded from certain positions. I mean, to give you an example, I'm actually currently looking for my next role. And obviously I look very closely at not only what is it like to serve somewhere as a female, but also to serve somewhere as an LGBTQ diplomat, which comes back to the intersectionality issue. And not everywhere is suitable for me. And I'm happy to consider workarounds, but in some places people have said, actually, you'd find it really difficult to do your job. So maybe it's not the posting for you. And I think that's the challenge for us, is that we want to get to a place where where it should be my decision to apply for something or not based on whether my life is going to be made incredibly difficult by going somewhere.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for sharing this personal note. Henk, any future challenges you would like to address?
Well, perhaps one challenge that we have at the moment, which is perhaps not only attached to the position of female diplomats, but is the question of what do you do with partners of diplomats when they are abroad, which is a theme that's both for female diplomats with a partner at home, as for male diplomats point. Not in every country you can find a job where you are able to work, and I think more and more this is seen as a problem by young couples, where more and more the norm is that both of them work and not one of the couple works. I think that's really a theme that we see coming up now. I'm very happy to see that my government, our policy is quite open to finding solutions for that. So one of the examples we had, which where there was spoken a lot about it in certain circles, was the ambassador to Israel had a partner who was the representative to the Palestinian authorities in and this was a male gay couple. So you can imagine that, let's say, this combination is a very interesting one, both from political as also from, say, a discussion about how do you look at that. So I see, I'm optimistic about the senior staff in the ministry seeing the challenges that we have, and also being courageous in taking new steps. You see that also I have seen it very much in the nominations of ambassadors to the Arab countries in the last years. I think the majority of new ambassadors in the countries over there have been female ambassadors, and that was also seen as quite a sign in those areas.
Thank you very much, Henk, for those inputs. That's very important and interesting. I would like to open the floor now to the audience. If anyone has some questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, or if you want to ask them in person, raise your Zoom hand or just write in the chat that you would like to ask a question. We're more than happy to see you and hear you. Okay, we have Stephanie. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you very much for this really interesting discussion. My question would go back to the beginning when Ambassador Salome Meyer mentioned the quota, that is something that maybe triggers a conversation, but is also debated, I would say. Maybe I would be interested to hear what are your takes on a quota, that maybe did it work historically, Lara Campbell, or how has been the experience in the different countries with quotas?
We have not had, political parties can set their own quotas for running candidates in municipal, provincial, or federal elections, and some do, but there haven't been sort of official government level quotas around representation at the Legislative Assembly or the House of Commons in Canada.
Maybe if I can talk about this one occasion of quotas as well, because I think as in Canada, as in the UK, or as in the Netherlands, quotas are not sort of a fixture generally, certainly not in the foreign ministry. But so what is my personal take on the quotas? I think it's a double-edged sword. But I do think that what this foreign minister did, there was 9 candidates, 6 that passed the exam, 6 men and 3 women. And instead of increasing the number of women, she just decreased the number of men. So the argument that the women were hired even though they weren't competent just didn't work out, but it did create this conversation. And I think at the end of the day, you know, after 30, 40, 50 years where women were allowed to become diplomats and still they hadn't reached the top, that's a structural problem. That's not a problem of a generation that didn't have opportunities. These women were competent, women diplomats were competent, but somehow they just didn't reach the top because the top was clogged by a more traditional or more old-fashioned, a more male-dominated group of people. So the quotas actually created a new reality, which helped because it did change the fabric of the organization, and it created a conversation. It didn't last very long. And the women who were recruited in that year did have, you know, sort of this image being less good, or, you know, there was a thing where, and I found myself also saying that, which is of course a stupid thing to do, but I also said, well, I'm not one of those women who were, I'm not a quota woman, I have been hired before that. And so actually I fed into this narrative, which made me think personally also as a woman, particularly as I go up in the hierarchy of the, you know, of the responsibility. But I think the way forward finally, I think is targets are very similar to the UK, trying to, you know, define targets that are achievable and that are being achieved, and particularly also a process and a policy that looks into, if the targets aren't achieved, what's actually the problem and how can we remedy those. And then finally, just as a last point, I do think that the notion of diversity, the added value of diversity, has become more important. So it's not we have to find more women because we need to find, you know, 50-50, but to actually, you know, embrace this because it's helpful for our foreign policy. How can you be credible in human rights, as a human rights defending country, if your own sort of core is not representing that either? I think the challenge will be that I see diplomacy become again more economically driven and more security policy driven, and these are traditionally sort of areas of diplomacy that are male dominated, and I think that is something that goes into training, that goes into mentorship, and it goes into networks as well. So it's a policy question, it's a structural question, and to bridge that too, if you manage to bridge that too, you don't need quotas, but quotas can create conversation that leads to those developments.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting how the debate on quota, I think it's one of the most heated discussions, and it has changed over time a bit. And I appreciate, Ambassador, that you talked about this. And then we got from Michelle, we got a very nice note. I think it's a good way to end this conversation. It's very interesting and a reminder of how grateful we can be today for the hard work of others before us to get us where we are today, and the ongoing work for where we are going to be all inclusive. So I think that's a very nice quote to end this. If there's any other question, I give another few seconds if somebody has a question. We have another thank you in the chat. But I would like to thank all the speakers, Ambassador Salome Meyer, the Consuls General Henk Snoeken and Nicole Davison, and Lara Campbell from SFU for joining us today. This was very enriching, very interesting, and I'm happy that we could host this event in this very special year for Switzerland. And if anyone has some questions, please reach out to us by email. And thank you very much for all the participants for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank
you.
Thank you.